Margaret sat quietly on the familiar sofa, her hands still holding the towel she had just folded, feeling the warmth of the house surrounding her. Everything was calm and peaceful, just like any ordinary day. But today, an unexpected storm rushed in without warning, without any sign at all. The front door opened, and in that instant, Margaret felt the air inside the house grow heavy. Footsteps struck the floor with force, as if someone were stepping on each passing moment, making everything in the house seem to pause. "I'm here." Ethan's voice echoed through the room, but it carried none of the warmth or affection a son would normally show his mother. This time his voice was cold and sharp, like a blade cutting through every trace of sweetness that had once existed in this home. Behind Ethan was Sophia, his wife. Margaret saw her walk in with a self-satisfied posture, her arms crossed over her chest, her face filled with arrogance. It had been a long time since Margaret had felt love from those closest to her, but today she clearly felt the distance between them. Ethan did not sit down. He stood there looking down at Margaret with a stern expression, as if announcing an undeniable truth. He began with calm words, but every sentence struck Margaret's heart like a heavy blow. "Mom, listen carefully. $500,000. If you don't help Sophia pay off her debt, you'll have to leave this house. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The sentence sounded simple, almost as if he were asking his mother to bring him a glass of water, but in Margaret's eyes it felt like a verdict. The words "leave this house" struck her like stones thrown directly at her face, leaving her stunned. She had spent her entire life building this home with her own devotion, yet now she was being treated like something that could simply be thrown away. Sophia said nothing at first. She only let out a mocking laugh before adding, "What do you even need this house for anymore, Mom? You're not going to live forever. Stop being so selfish." Each word fired like a bullet into the precious memories Margaret had kept in her heart. The word selfish hung in the air, tightening around her chest. Ethan continued without the slightest hint of sympathy, his voice steady as if he were discussing something completely unimportant. "You live here because we tolerate it. Don't forget that." Those words felt like a hard slap across Margaret's face. She had given birth to Ethan. She had raised him with all her love, and now the very son she once cherished was telling her she was nothing more than a burden to endure. Margaret's silence became the only shelter she could find in that moment. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar, no longer the place she once called home. Everything, from the paintings on the wall to the table where the family used to sit together for dinner, to the keepsakes of her late husband, seemed to be pushed into the harsh light of reality. She had built everything with her own hands, yet now the house and all its memories were treated as meaningless. Ethan did not stop. He continued talking about numbers and deadlines, but Margaret could no longer hear anything. The words "leave this house" echoed again and again in her mind, drowning out everything else. She looked toward the window, the place where her husband used to stand every morning, watching the first light of day spread across the sky. She felt a silence covering the entire house, a different kind of silence, like the stillness that follows a threat. In that moment, she understood that her son's demand was not a negotiation. It was a declaration that she no longer had any value. She was not simply his mother. She was an obstacle in his plans. "We're not asking for much. You should be grateful we've let you stay here this long," Sophia added again, her words cutting deeply into Margaret's heart. Margaret remembered every sacrifice she had made in the past, the long nights of work, the extra hours she took on just to care for her family. Yet now she was left only with silence. The silence of someone who had grown used to being underestimated, being treated as if she were useless. Ethan looked at Margaret with an exhausted expression, as if he were tired of her very existence. In that moment, Margaret finally understood that the issue was not the money. This was not really about debt. It was about power and control. They did not need her anymore. They simply wanted to erase her presence. Margaret slowly stood up, not because of anger, but because a decision was beginning to take shape inside her. Silence, she knew, was the only thing that could protect her right now. She looked at Ethan, then at Sophia, and within that silence she felt a strange sense of freedom, something they would never truly understand. When they finally left the room, Margaret remained sitting there, looking at the neatly folded towels resting on her lap, like a reflection of her own life, orderly, quiet, obedient, yet also deeply exhausted. The threat had never been only about the house or the debt. It was about the quiet control they wanted to claim. And Margaret, within that silence, had already begun planning her next move. Margaret sat by the window while the faint light of the morning slipped gently through the cloudy glass. She looked outside, where small waves touched the shore as if whispering stories from the past. The feeling inside her now was like the cold sea breeze, calm yet filled with quiet sorrow. Memories slowly returned to her, moment after moment from a life that once was. She remembered the days when she was a single mother, struggling with work, carrying the entire weight of the family on her own shoulders, yet never complaining. All those efforts now seemed to have been forgotten, treated as if they meant nothing. As Ethan's mother, she had devoted her entire life to caring for him. She remembered clearly the days when he was still a small boy, his tiny hands tightly holding hers, his bright eyes full of curiosity about the world around him. Whenever Ethan cried, she was always the one there, holding him close and comforting him until he finally fell asleep. Even when she was exhausted, even when she could not fully understand everything happening in life, she always placed her family above everything else. That was all Margaret could do, everything she could give. But now, sitting alone in this house, Margaret felt a deep coldness inside her heart. Ethan, the son she had raised with all her devotion, now saw her as nothing more than a burden. The sense of betrayal did not come from the fact that he asked her to pay Sophia's debt. It came from the way he now looked at her. She was no longer the loving mother who had always been ready to sacrifice for her child. She had become simply a woman who no longer had value in his eyes. Margaret remembered the times she had refused Ethan's requests in the past, the moments when he came to her with hopeful eyes and papers in his hands asking for money. The first time was when Ethan was 22 years old, full of enthusiasm and convinced that his business ideas would change his life. He came to see her with shining eyes, spreading out sheets of paper filled with numbers and plans. He wanted money immediately to invest in an idea that no one else in the family truly understood. Margaret listened carefully and then refused. She loved her son deeply, but she knew money could not be spent carelessly. Ethan could not accept that refusal. He turned away, his face darkening, and in a moment of anger, he shouted that she did not believe in him. That simple sentence haunted Margaret for many years afterward. She could never forget the feeling of seeing her son look at her as if she were someone who did not understand him, someone who did not support him. In Ethan's eyes, she had suddenly become a mother who did not know how to love or how to trust. Several years later, when Ethan got married, the situation did not improve. Margaret had heard many rumors about his wife, Sophia, yet she tried to remain silent and accept things she did not like just to keep peace in the family. But when she first met Sophia, a sense of unease appeared almost immediately. Sophia was ambitious, always trying to draw attention and flatter others. Margaret felt that she did not truly care about Ethan. Something about her words felt insincere, and that made Margaret cautious. Even so, Margaret said nothing. She did not want to become the person who destroyed her son's happiness. But when Ethan asked to use money from Margaret's retirement fund to pay for his wedding, her heart could not remain calm. She loved her son, but she could not blindly follow decisions she believed were wrong. She began asking questions, quietly looking into things, and eventually discovered that Sophia had enormous debts that no one else seemed to know about. Margaret decided to talk with Ethan, advising him to slow down and think carefully. But this time, Ethan refused to listen. He became furious and accused her of not wanting him to be happy. He shouted that she always wanted to keep him small and never wanted him to grow up. Those words felt like knives cutting into Margaret's heart. She had done everything for him, sacrificed more than he would ever know. Yet now he saw her as someone standing in the way of his happiness. She could not understand how her son had become this person, why he was willing to throw away everything she had done for him just for the glitter of a luxurious life that had no real protection beneath it. Then what she had feared eventually happened. Ethan's marriage ended when Sophia left, taking with her the very money Margaret had worried would disappear. But when the truth finally came out, no one in the family apologized to Margaret. She was not praised for trying to warn her son. Instead, she was criticized for not doing enough, for not stopping everything before it happened. That was when Margaret realized a painful truth. No matter what she did or said, she would always be the one blamed in the end. Sophia had only been a newcomer, yet she quickly took control of her place within the family. From the moment she appeared, she never allowed Margaret to stand firmly on her own ground. Margaret did not speak much, she mostly stayed silent. Yet whenever she did speak, her words were twisted. If she remained silent, she was accused of calculating silence. If she spoke, she was accused of criticizing. The threat now was no longer just a conversation. It had become a battle, one in which Margaret had no choice but to prepare herself. She could no longer stand still. She could not continue enduring everything quietly. What she had lost over the years had now become clearer than ever before. The feeling of being abandoned and misunderstood no longer hurt her the same way. Instead, she felt something else rising inside her, the need to act, the need to protect what little she still had left. That night, as the lights in the house slowly faded, Margaret sat alone in the living room, a deep silence surrounding her. Each steady tick of the clock seemed to remind her that time never stopped moving forward, yet she could not escape the feeling of being trapped. Everything around her suddenly seemed unimportant, no longer valuable, when the very son she had carried, raised, and cared for now treated her like an outsider. The next morning, when Margaret woke up, the atmosphere in the house had changed. Ethan and Sophia had returned, like a new wave rising, powerful and merciless. Ethan was no longer the obedient boy she once cared for. Now he had become a calculating man, willing to use any means necessary to achieve what he wanted. Sophia, with her cold eyes and arrogant attitude, followed behind him like a shadow that never left. They were no longer family members she loved. They felt like invaders, pushing her out of her own life. "We need to settle this quickly, Mom," Ethan said, his voice firm and completely lacking patience. "There is no reason to drag this out. You need to sign the papers and help us pay that debt. If not, you will have to leave this house immediately." Sophia stood beside him, nodding slightly as if she were the one controlling everything. "We are not asking for much. We just want you to help a little. You are not going to live here forever anyway," she said without the slightest embarrassment, as if Margaret were nothing more than an object in the house, someone who had no right to decide anything. Those words struck Margaret's mind like a heavy blow. She could not understand how her own son could treat her this way. A whole lifetime of devotion, a whole lifetime of sacrifice, and now she was being treated like someone unnecessary, like a burden. The feeling of being abandoned and disrespected pressed heavily on her heart. But Margaret refused to allow herself to be weak. She could not let them continue trampling over her like this. "It is not that I do not want to help you," Margaret began, her voice steady though it carried deep exhaustion. "But not everything can be solved with money, especially when I know you do not truly understand what I have been through." Ethan looked at her without changing his expression, his eyes filled with frustration. He had no interest in listening to her reasons. He only wanted her signature on the documents so everything would be finished. "Do not make things more difficult. Do you not understand, Mom? It is simple. We just need the money. You can stay here if you help us," he repeated, not realizing that what he was demanding was not only money, but also the respect he had long ago abandoned. Sophia continued pressing, twisting the situation to favor Ethan, acting as if everything already belonged to them, and Margaret was merely an unwanted presence. "You just need to sign the paper. It is nothing serious," she insisted, her cold eyes sharp like a blade. "We have already let you live here for far too long. You should be grateful for that." Margaret felt as if she could barely breathe. Those words were like arrows piercing straight through her heart. She had sacrificed so much for this family, had done everything she could to keep their lives stable and secure, yet now she was treated as if she were useless, forced to give up everything she had built. The memories of this house, the images of her late husband, All of it had become sacrifices in the power game between her son and her daughter-in-law. But Margaret did not cry. She would not allow herself to appear weak in this moment. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes, searching for even a small trace of the love and understanding she once believed he had. But there was nothing there. In his eyes, there was only cold ambition. He was no longer her son. He was simply a man trying to climb higher by stepping on the people closest to him. She realized then that this situation was no longer simply about paying a debt. It had become a battle over power and control. They wanted to drive her out of this house and take everything she had spent a lifetime building. They did not care about her feelings. They did not care about the past. They did not care about the sacrifices she had made. They only cared about their own interests, and they would do anything to get them. Margaret refused to let herself be defeated. "I am not useless," she said firmly. "You may try to force me to leave. You may try to force me to sign, but I will not allow you to control me so easily." Every word she spoke carried an unshakable strength. Margaret knew that the time had come for her to act, not only to protect herself, but to protect everything she had spent her entire life building. When Ethan and Sophia finally left, Margaret remained sitting in the living room, once again looking out through the window. The feeling in her heart now was not anger or disappointment. It was the quiet calm of someone who had fought with all her strength and finally understood that some battles did not need to be fought. Sometimes it was enough to step away in silence. She was already prepared, not to surrender, but to allow Ethan and Sophia's own decisions to bring their consequences. She knew that even if they believed they had already won, within her silence, they would eventually face a truth they had never expected. When the sunlight finally faded away, Margaret once again sat in her familiar place in the living room, the spot where for so many years she had looked out through the window, watching the seasons change, watching the waves roll gently toward the shore, believing that everything in her life was peaceful and steady. But now this house no longer gave her a sense of safety. Every step Ethan and Sophia took, every word they spoke, made her feel as if control over her own life was slowly being taken away, like waves creeping forward and carrying away everything she once treasured. Margaret felt a quiet ache deep inside her heart, not because of the money Ethan and Sophia were demanding, but because of the way they treated her. The feeling of being pushed aside, of being excluded from her own family, had never made her feel so empty before. The house she and her husband had built during their hardest years had now become a battlefield, a place where she herself was the one being invaded and rejected. Yet within the silence of the night, Margaret felt no hatred. She was not angry, and she did not cry. Deep inside, she understood that this was not the moment for loud confrontation or resistance. This was the moment to think carefully about everything, about the way she had lived, about everything she had given, and about how she would continue living from this point forward. In that moment, silence was the most powerful weapon she possessed. Margaret did not rush into any decision, yet in her heart, she had already begun to imagine a plan. Not a plan to fight Ethan and Sophia in the way they expected, but a plan to protect herself from their manipulation. Her entire life, she had been the one who cared for others, the one who sacrificed for her family, but now she could not continue living in an environment filled with pressure and disrespect. Part of her understood that if she did not act now, she would remain trapped forever in a cycle of abused silence and meaningless sacrifice. In truth, Margaret had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Not because she wanted revenge or wished to destroy her family, but because she knew that one day the son she loved might stop seeing her as a mother and begin seeing her only as an extra presence, someone no longer worthy of love. And when that day arrived, she would not endure it for even one more moment. That night, when everything had finally grown quiet and the house was once again wrapped in silence, Margaret walked into her bedroom and took out the papers she had kept for many years. They were documents that she and her husband had prepared in case situations like this ever happened. She had never imagined life would lead her to such a crossroads, yet she was not truly surprised. Her husband, who had passed away many years earlier, had always told her that preparation was the most important thing. If anything ever happened, she must have a plan ready to protect herself and everything they had built together. Those documents now were not only legal tools, they had become a shield protecting her from the control of people who no longer understood the value of family. Margaret did not need to prove anything. She did not need to explain anything to Ethan or Sophia. Her decisions had been prepared long ago, and now all she needed to do was carry them out. The next morning, Margaret did not rush. She walked into the living room, the place where Ethan and Sophia still believed they could control everything. But she did not hurry to confront them. Margaret had learned that sometimes silence was the strongest answer, stronger than any explanation. She did not want to create more tension. She only needed them to see that she was not someone easily defeated, not someone who would walk away from everything simply because they demanded it. When Ethan and Sophia returned in the afternoon, they saw her sitting there calmly, yet in her eyes there was a determination they had never seen before. Margaret said nothing, but the way she looked at them made them begin to feel that something was not right. They had believed she would be afraid, that she would worry about being forced out of the house, but that was not what they saw. Her silence was not surrender. It was careful preparation. "We need to sign the papers soon, Mom," Ethan said, but this time his voice was no longer as confident as before. Something in Margaret's eyes made him hesitate. Sophia stood behind him, trying to appear firm, yet Margaret could see the uneasiness in her. She was no longer standing above everyone else. Now it seemed she feared something she could not control. Margaret smiled, but it was not the smile of defeat. "I need one more night to think," she said, her voice low and steady with confidence. "Let me make my decision clearly." Ethan and Sophia did not know how to respond. They had believed she was weak, but Margaret had decided that she would never allow herself to be manipulated again. She had already had enough time to think, and now she had a plan of her own. Margaret did not need to prove anything to them. She only needed them to understand that she was not someone they could easily force. Margaret then walked outside into the yard and looked toward the sea, the place where her husband used to stand every morning. In that moment, she felt a quiet peace, along with a renewed determination. It was not about leaving, it was about moving forward, stepping away from a life that no longer belonged to her. Margaret stood still in the room, her eyes following the rolling waves outside the window, where the sea seemed to mirror her state of mind. Her heart was filled with tangled thoughts, yet there was a strange sense of calm within her. This trip was not an escape, it was her decision, a deliberate retreat. The night before, when her thoughts had finally settled, she clearly realized that time was no longer her companion. Time was pushing her toward a crossroads, and if she refused to choose, she would remain trapped forever in a vortex of demands and manipulation. She was ready. When Ethan and Sophia returned the next morning, Margaret's silence made them uneasy. Ethan had grown used to his mother's compliance, used to the way she always yielded and followed his wishes. But today he sensed something different. Margaret did not appear weak the way he expected. She was not panicking or pleading. She simply sat there, looking straight at them, without saying a single word. Sophia, never a patient person, stood beside Ethan with a slight frown. She noticed the change in Margaret, a feeling that the woman was holding on to a secret they could not grasp. Yet they both believed that Margaret would eventually be frightened, that she would give in under pressure and sign the papers they had already prepared. A part of them, especially Sophia, felt uneasy about that calmness, but Margaret did not allow them to see any hesitation. She stood up, her steps gentle but firm. "I will not sign any documents today," she said, her voice low and calm, yet carrying the weight of a warning. "Do not think that just because you pressure me, I will follow along." Ethan looked at his mother, and the certainty in his eyes was no longer as strong as before. The image of the frail old woman he once considered weak now made him feel as if some unseen force was holding him back. "Mom, don't make this harder for us. We just want everything to be simple. Don't you understand?" Margaret did not rush to answer. What she felt inside was not anger, but a clear awareness of what she needed to do. She had lived her entire life as a caretaker, someone who always yielded. But no, she could not continue that way any longer. It was enough. It was time for her to protect herself, to act so that she would not be erased from her own life. She looked directly into Ethan's eyes, her gaze deep and unwavering. "You think I'm easy to control, but I'm not. It's time for me to stand up, Ethan. You cannot keep believing that I have no right to make my own decisions." Her voice rose, stronger than it had ever been. The change in Margaret made Ethan hesitate. He did not know what to do or how to respond. Uneasiness spread through him. He had always been used to controlling her, used to her doing whatever he wanted. But today, Margaret was no longer the same. "So you want more time, Mom?" Ethan shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, though his voice carried a trace of awkwardness. "Fine. Think about it a little longer. But don't forget, we can't wait forever." He turned and walked away, his impatience clearly visible. Sophia remained for a moment, and her eyes briefly passing over Margaret before she turned and followed Ethan. She said nothing, but in her mind a question kept circling. What is happening to her? That calmness made her feel that something was wrong. Margaret was no longer the same as before. Sophia began to understand that what Margaret was doing was not the behavior of a fragile old mother who could easily be manipulated. It was the action of a woman who had endured far too much and was now reclaiming her strength. Margaret stood in the living room, watching them until they completely disappeared from sight. A sense of relief rose within her, though it was not satisfaction. She knew that what she had just done was not a simple decision. It was preparation for a battle she was ready to enter, not with anger, but with patience and long preparation. She did not need to say much. She only needed to act. Everything she had prepared for so long was about to begin working. She walked into the bedroom and picked up the old suitcase she had prepared the night before. Everything in the room seemed to remind her of the past, memories of her husband, memories of the difficult years they had struggled through together. Those things had become marks of her life, but Margaret no longer allowed those memories to control her. She opened the suitcase and placed inside it the things she needed. They were only simple belongings, yet they carried a much deeper meaning. At that moment, Margaret's determination was stronger than it had ever been. She was not leaving out of fear. She was leaving to declare that she still had the right to decide for herself, the right to live freely, not as someone's possession within this family. When morning came, Margaret did not say a word. She quietly left the house she had lived in for so many years. Yet there was no regret in her heart. She stepped outside, leaving everything behind her, not because she had lost, but because she was ready for a future she could build with her own hands. A future where she would not have to live under control, where she would no longer have to endure. As Margaret walked out of the house, no one knew that she had already taken control of everything. Not through arguments or loud confrontations, but through silence and the preparation of a woman who clearly understood what mattered most to her. She did not need anyone's approval. She only needed the freedom to live the life she chose. Margaret had passed through a long night filled with silence and reflection. She did not sleep, not because of anxiety or fear, but because the thoughts in her mind kept swirling like relentless waves crashing against the shore. She could not forget what had just happened. The feeling of being abandoned and manipulated still lingered in every breath she took. But today, as the sun rose, Margaret no longer felt uneasy. The fear was gone, replaced by a new firmness, a calm that came from finally understanding what she needed to do. That morning, she decided to step out of her small room and do something she had delayed for far too long. At this point, she could no longer sit and wait. She had to act. Margaret walked to the cabinet where she had kept all the important documents her husband had prepared long ago. These were not ordinary papers. They were tools meant to protect her from intrusion and control by Ethan and Sophia. These documents were not only meant to protect the house, they were meant to protect her from being suffocated in a life that no longer belonged to her. She picked up the papers and quietly reviewed each clause that her husband had drafted before his passing. Those clauses were not only legal provisions, they were reminders that she was not a weak person. No one had the right to take away her life simply because they wanted to claim what she had spent her entire life building. The years they had spent together creating this home, the beautiful memories of their family, All of it had been protected, not by love alone, but by careful preparation that she had failed to recognize earlier. Her whole life, she had not been loved the way a mother deserved to be loved, but she had loved herself enough to understand that she could protect herself when it truly mattered. Margaret sat down at the wooden table where she had once shared countless meals with her family. A quiet stillness filled the room. She looked at the papers, and for a brief moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. She could feel the strength within her. It had been a long time since Margaret had felt that way. But now she understood that she no longer needed to explain anything. She did not need to be present in this battle, and she certainly did not need to explain to Ethan or Sophia what she was doing. What she had done was already enough. She picked up the phone and called the only person she knew could help at this moment, the family's lawyer, the man her husband had chosen to represent all legal matters concerning their property. At that moment, Margaret felt so calm that it was almost as if she were standing outside the situation, quietly observing the events unfolding around her without needing to intervene deeply. The call lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough for her to understand that she was no longer alone in this fight. When the family lawyer arrived, Margaret already had every document prepared. He was a middle-aged man who had worked with her husband for many years. When he looked at the papers Margaret handed him, a flash of understanding crossed his eyes. He did not need to ask a single question. He had known everything for a long time. This story was nothing new to him. Just as Margaret had suspected, her husband had prepared everything, not only to protect the house, but also to protect her from those who might try to take advantage of her. "Margaret," he said in a deep and steady voice, "you did the right thing. This is exactly what needed to be done. Your husband never trusted the innocence of this world, and neither do I. Everything he left for you was meant to protect you from the kind of people who would try to use you." Margaret said nothing. She simply looked at the document in her hand. Every word on it was not just a legal signature. It was a promise, a safeguard she had not recognized soon enough. As the lawyer explained the clauses in her husband's will, Margaret did not feel surprised. Instead, she felt a quiet stillness, as though everything had already been arranged in advance to protect her. "This will be activated automatically if any form of coercion occurs," the lawyer continued. "As soon as there is any sign of pressure or force, this house will be transferred to a charity that supports elderly women who suffer from financial abuse, and all related assets will also be transferred." Margaret took a slow, deep breath, and a sense of peace rose within her. For years she had lived under manipulation, but now her husband's preparation allowed her to see the truth more clearly than ever before. No one could force her anymore. No one could take away her right to make her own choices. She was not simply a fragile mother. She was a woman who had learned how to protect herself, even if it required sacrificing everything. When everything was finally settled, the lawyer left after giving clear instructions. Margaret remained sitting in the room, surrounded by a quiet sense of peace. She knew that what she had done was not only to protect the property, but also to protect her dignity and her rights. And when she looked around the house again, it no longer felt like a place of manipulation. This was a place where she could live freely, a life of her own choosing, without having to endure unreasonable demands from her son or daughter-in-law. Margaret stood up, stepped out onto the porch, and looked toward the sea. The wind gently brushed through her hair, and she knew that everything was ready. She no longer needed to explain anything. Everything had already been set in motion. And now she would move forward, not because she had been defeated, but because she had won, quietly, steadily, and with a strength that needed no noise to be felt. Margaret did not return to that house. Right after the lawyer left, she stepped outside, leaving behind every memory, every conflict, and every tension. The house she had spent her entire life building no longer belonged to her. It was no longer the home of a mother or a wife. It had become a place for those who wanted to control and manipulate. Yet Margaret did not feel pain. She did not feel any sense of loss. Instead, she felt a strange and unexpected relief. She walked out of the house and gently closed the door behind her. There was no farewell, no glance back, Only silence surrounded the moment, as if it were a final decision, a step that could never be reversed. She no longer had to endure threats, no longer had to live under the pressure of people she had loved for so many years. That silence, though quiet, carried an undeniable strength. Margaret did not know where she would go. She only knew that she needed to leave, needed to distance herself from the place that had become a battlefield, the place where she had been pushed to this point. She stopped at a small cafe by the roadside, where simple tables and the rich aroma of coffee welcomed anyone who entered. The atmosphere there was warm, completely different from the coldness that had filled her home. The waitress smiled, but Margaret simply shook her head gently. She did not need much. She only needed a little space to breathe, to feel the unfamiliar freedom she had never experienced before. When she sat down, Margaret did not rush to do anything. She simply remained quiet, looking out the window at the people passing by, each of them busy with their own lives. Yet she no longer felt lost in that flow of life. She felt as though she had become part of the world again, no longer trapped by the chains of family expectations, no longer forced to sacrifice the precious parts of her life just to please others. She had done enough. Now it was time for her to live for herself. Even so, deep inside, a part of her could not completely forget Ethan and Sophia. Margaret was not a woman who could easily forget the people close to her, especially her son. Even though he had treated her cruelly, even though he had forced her to choose between money and her own life, in her heart, Ethan was still the son she had once loved with everything she had. And that truth made the pain even deeper. But Margaret understood that she could not live forever in blind forgiveness. She could not continue sacrificing herself only to be taken advantage of. She had to move forward, had to walk away in order to rediscover her own worth. Over the years, she had not given herself enough love or respect, but now she would begin to do exactly that. Every step she took was not an escape. It was a journey back to herself. The next day, when Margaret moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, she felt the difference immediately. There were no more raised voices, no more cold stares, no more pressure forcing her to obey. She could live freely. She could do what she wanted without being criticized or judged. The paintings, the memories, the objects that once seemed meaningless to others now carried their true value again. She did not need to prove anything to anyone. She only needed to live honestly with herself. Margaret did not make plans for the future. She did not know what she would do or where she would go, but she knew one thing with certainty: she no longer needed anyone's approval. She had spent far too much time living for others. Now it was time to live for herself. A week passed, and Margaret still had not received a single call from Ethan. She did not call him either. That strange feeling, the calmness within her, made her realize that connection was not always a good thing. Sometimes distance was the only way to see clearly, to understand what we truly need and what we must leave behind in life. Then one evening, as Margaret sat in her small apartment watching the leaves fall outside the window, the phone rang. It was Ethan. His voice was no longer hard and determined as before. Instead, it carried worry and panic, emotions Margaret had never heard from him. "Mom, where are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't understand. Why did you do this? We're family. You can't just leave like that." Margaret looked at the phone and did not answer immediately. She knew that there was no longer any need to explain anything to him. He was no longer the son she once knew. He was simply a man struggling with the consequences of his own choices, a man who had never learned how to love in the right way. What she felt was not anger, but relief. She had done the right thing. She had stood her ground. "I am no longer part of this family, Ethan, and I cannot spend my life fulfilling your demands. You may call it leaving, but I call it taking a step to find myself again," Margaret said, her voice steady, without the slightest hesitation. There was silence on the other end of the line. Margaret could imagine Ethan crying, struggling with a truth he did not want to face. But she was no longer there to save him. Margaret had already saved herself. She gently ended the call and remained seated in her small room, looking out the window at the quiet street outside. The feeling inside her was not loneliness. It was peace. Margaret knew that this was the life she truly deserved. Silence was not a retreat, it was a victory. Margaret no longer had to face the angry stares or the bitter words of Ethan and Sophia. The feeling of being pushed out of her own family no longer gnawed at her heart the way it once had. Time passed, and there was not a single phone call, not a single message from her son. Even so, Margaret did not regret her decision. She felt as if she were living in a new world, a place where the shadows of the past no longer lingered, where manipulation and emotional abuse no longer followed her. For the first time in many years, she could truly feel what freedom was. Margaret's small apartment was simple but complete. It was not large and not luxurious, yet every morning when she woke up, she felt a strange and comforting peace. The view outside the window changed with each passing day. Autumn leaves drifted through the wind, sunlight slipped through the narrow gap of the window and rested on the table where Margaret sat each morning, enjoying the black coffee she had loved for so long. Everything was small and quiet, yet filled with life, and she no longer felt like an outsider in the world. Even so, deep in her heart, she could not completely forget everything that had happened. The disappointment, the sense of loss, and the pain of facing her son's indifference had not fully faded. Margaret still thought about Ethan, not with anger, but with regret. She still could not understand how he had become the person he was now. The son she had raised, taught, and protected for so many years had turned and treated her like an enemy. But she had learned something important. Forgiveness and acceptance do not always mean keeping a relationship. Sometimes forgiveness simply means letting go, allowing yourself to live without being chained to the past. One afternoon, while Margaret was tidying up her small apartment, a letter from the lawyer arrived. Inside the letter was a notice she had not expected. Ethan and Sophia had not stopped at pressuring her. They had filed a lawsuit demanding that she return the house. She was not surprised, yet a cold feeling spread slowly through her body. The letter was not simply an announcement of an event. It was a blow aimed at her dignity. They refused to stop, refused to accept that she had already made her decision. They refused to allow her to live a free life. Margaret held the letter and stared at the printed words for a long time. Anger was no longer the emotion that controlled her. Instead, a sharp clarity spread through her mind. It felt like a final mark placed at the end of everything she had endured for so long. This was not the first time she had faced a struggle, but this time she knew clearly that she could not step back anymore. She had made her decision long ago, and nothing could change it now. She placed the letter on the table and let out a quiet breath. The phone calls, the threatening messages from Ethan and Sophia could not make her change her mind. She understood that this was the moment she had to take control of her own life. No one had the right to force her anymore. Not Ethan, not Sophia, and not anyone else. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She sat in the armchair, the dim light of the lamp falling softly across her face as her distant eyes looked out the window. Everything seemed to sink into darkness. The world outside continued moving forward, but for her it felt as if time had paused, as if everything was waiting for the change she was about to create. Margaret realized something clearly. She was not only fighting for the house, she was fighting for herself, for the right to live and exist freely without depending on anyone. At last, she decided to act. Margaret contacted the lawyer and asked him to send the necessary documents so she could prepare for the legal battle ahead. She could not allow things to simply pass like this. Margaret was not someone who ran away. She was someone who faced challenges with quiet strength. The next day, when she went to meet the lawyer, she felt strength in every step she took. Every word the lawyer spoke was not only legal advice, but also encouragement that helped her continue her journey. Margaret understood that she no longer had to endure the consequences of other people's decisions. What she had done was not an act against her family. It was an act to protect her own worth. For far too long, she had allowed herself to be underestimated, to be treated as someone who had no right to make decisions. Now she could stand firmly, no longer controlled by what others wanted. When Margaret walked out of the lawyer's office, she felt a strange sense of peace. She no longer worried about whether they might succeed in forcing her out. She had prepared everything. She had done everything according to plan. Once everything was set on the right path, she would have nothing left to fear. Looking out at the street, Margaret smiled gently. Life might still bring challenges, but she understood that nothing could ever shake her determination again. Only one truth remained: she would never allow anyone to control her life ever again. A month had passed since Margaret decided to leave the old house, the place that had witnessed so many memories, both joyful and painful. Her small apartment had now become her true home, not because it was luxurious, but because it gave her a sense of peace and freedom she had never felt before. Every morning, warm sunlight streamed through the window, waking her gently in a space that she completely controlled. There were no more demands, no more pressure from family members, and she no longer had to live in a world where she was treated like a burden. Life there was simple, yet it brought Margaret a kind of calm she had never known. The silence in the room was no longer loneliness. It was a space where she could rediscover herself. The feeling of freedom and lightness was no longer something distant. Each morning, Margaret drank her coffee while looking out the window, watching the leaves fall from the trees, and she felt that every moment was precious. Even so, despite the peace she had found, the memories of those dark days within her family could not be completely erased from her mind. Ethan and Sophia were still like shadows in her life, not because they were physically present in her daily routine, but because their betrayal had left a deep mark in her heart. Margaret did not want to relive those days, yet sometimes the images of Ethan, the cruel words he once spoke, returned to her thoughts without warning. Even then, Margaret no longer felt wounded or pained by it. She had learned to see everything differently, not with hatred, but with calm understanding. She knew her son had chosen his own path, and there was nothing she could do to change that choice. Margaret's freedom was not simply the absence of them, it was the absence of their negative influence over her life. One day, while Margaret was organizing some documents in her apartment, an unexpected call came from a familiar number. She looked at the phone screen and felt her heart beat a little faster. It was Ethan. A strange feeling rose inside her, not anger but surprise. She had never thought he would call again. Margaret looked at the phone for a moment before deciding to answer. "Hello, Mom." Ethan's voice was soft, yet there was an urgent tone beneath it. I don't know where to begin. I just want to say, I'm sorry." For the first time in many years, Margaret heard sincerity in her son's voice, not the coldness or arrogance she had grown used to. The words "I'm sorry" struck her heart like a powerful blow, not because she felt pity for him, but because it made her realize something. Everything she had once hoped for had arrived far too late. "Ethan," Margaret began, her voice calm but carrying a slight chill, "how do you think I should feel hearing that apology now? After everything you did to me, to our family, you come here and say you are sorry. I don't need your apology, Ethan." There was a moment of silence. Ethan did not respond right away. She could hear him sigh on the other end of the phone, as if he were struggling with his own emotions. "You may not forgive me. I understand that. But at least I want you to know that I realize things went too far. I cannot change the past, but I want you to know that I regret it." Margaret looked out the window, her eyes softening slightly. What she felt was not pain. It was a strange calmness. She did not need Ethan's apology. She had gone through too much, for too long, to return to empty words from someone who had come too late. "Ethan, I gave you every chance to change, but you chose your own path. I cannot change you, just as you cannot change me. I do not need you to come back, and I do not need you to seek forgiveness from me. I only need you to understand that I have lived enough." She paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and continued, "And you must do the same. You must learn to stand on your own and take responsibility for everything you have done." Everything Margaret said was not meant to release anger. It was meant to affirm that she had moved beyond all negative emotions. She no longer allowed anger to control her, no longer allowed pain to cloud her judgment. It was a turning point, an ending, but also the beginning of something new. "I don't know what else to say," Ethan said, his voice filled with disappointment and regret. "I don't know if we can ever start over, but I truly want you to know that I love you." Margaret did not answer immediately. She smiled softly, not because she did not care, but because she understood something deeply. Love alone cannot always repair everything. Sometimes silence and letting go are enough. Good luck to you, Ethan, Margaret said, her voice gentle yet firm, like a sincere blessing that also carried a sense of finality. The call ended. Margaret did not feel relief or happiness. What she felt was peace, as if a heavy burden had finally been set down. She no longer had to worry about trying to preserve what had already passed. Her life now belonged to her, and no one could change that. Margaret turned again to look out the window, where the first rays of a new day were spreading across the ground. She knew that life would continue moving forward, but nothing could change her decision anymore. She was free, and that was all she needed. Margaret's story is not only the journey of a woman overcoming hardship, it is also a lesson about the strength of determination and the value of freedom. Sometimes silence and the decision to stand firm are the most powerful ways to protect yourself from manipulation and abuse. Margaret did not run away. She chose to stand up and take control of her own life. This story can serve as a reminder to anyone who feels forgotten or controlled that they still have the power to change their life, no matter their age or circumstances. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to share it and leave your thoughts in the comments. Please like and subscribe so you will not miss more inspiring stories like this. You never know when your own story might help someone else find light in the darkness. Live truthfully as yourself because you deserve nothing less.